So let's go ahead and get started. So welcome to our webinar on reinventing workplace well-being. And just know that this webinar is being recorded and you'll be sent a link to the recording after the webinar today. So you can replay that anytime, send it to coworkers. Definitely, it'll be accessible to you. Everyone's going to be muted on this webinar, so please enter any questions you have as we're going along in the Q&A section at the bottom of the Zoom window, and we'll get to those at the end. So we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the webinar today set aside for questions. So definitely be thinking of some questions for Christina and Prem, and we'll get to those later. Today, we're going to dive into how to support employees in a changing work environment. So with the Great Resignation still going strong, employers need to make sure that they're meeting the needs of their people. Because not only is turnover really costly, but losing top performers can also really hurt morale and motivation as well. So today we'll be looking at how you can improve your employee experience and better support your employees' well-being. So here's our agenda for today. We're going to get started by talking about the Great Resignation and what it means. Why are so many employees leaving, and how does engagement play into that? Then we'll dive into ITA Group's research to examine how psychology and engagement are linked. We'll talk about the types of engagement initiatives that are most effective. And then finally, we have a free resource that we're going to share with you all to help kickstart your retention efforts during the Great Resignation. So be sure to stick around to learn more about that. And then, as I mentioned at the end, we'll have some time set aside for Q&A. So just put those questions in the Q&A box in Zoom, and we'll get to those at the end. But before we dive in, I wanted to share a brief introduction to what we do here at Cooleaf. Cooleaf's experience platform helps companies to engage with, recognize, and reward their people. Using Cooleaf, you can enable your employees to give shout outs to one another for living core values and going above and beyond. And what makes Cooleaf really unique is the way we partner with our customers to develop an ongoing strategy for employee experience. So employee experience isn't just this one-time effort, but something that we really see as evolving and growing over time. So Cooleaf helps you maintain engagement through a programming strategy that includes virtual events to bring teams together, challenges that aligns with your goals. So we do things like step challenges, healthy eating challenges, and like photo sharing challenges, which really helps to get to know team members and really build those bonds. And then we also do pulse surveys, so you can help measure your organization's efforts around engagement and health and wellness and diversity and inclusion as well. And all of this is also incentivized with reward points that employees can then redeem for prizes like gift cards, charity donations, or experiences. So that's who we are, and I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speakers for today. Prem Bhatia is the co-founder here at Cooleaf. Prior to co-founding Cooleaf, he played roles in management consulting, business development, and product management with organizations like American Express and McKesson. So, hey, Prem.
Hey, Melissa. Thanks.
And then we also have Christina Zurek. She is a respected analyst and thought leader on employee engagement and workplace culture. Using primary research alongside years of experience crafting employee engagement strategies, she directs the vision and positioning of the employee experience solutions developed by ITA Group, an engagement agency. So welcome, Christina.
Thanks, Melissa. Happy to be here. Hey, everyone.
Thanks, Christina. So with that said, now I'm going to turn it over to Prem to share where we are in the Great Resignation right now.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Melissa. I appreciate everybody being here today. So I'm sure a lot of what we're going to cover here is not news to most people that are aware of what's happening generally in the world today. We're at a really interesting time in terms of the kind of the life cycle of where we've got a bunch of generational change that's happening in the workplace, which clearly we talked about probably even before the last year and a half, but over the last 6 to 12 months, we've seen something really interesting happen. We are in the midst of what's been called the Great Resignation. A lot of people are calling it the Great Reckoning. Some people sort of, have differing opinions on what's actually happening here. But at the end of the day, right now we have the most job vacancies in over 2 decades. We've got quits at nearly historical highs, and we've got a shrinkage in the working age population. So clearly there's a cocktail of sort of factors right now that are playing into everyone's thinking. You don't need to go far to kind of see this. You can skim anything, whether it's, a major paper like New York Times, or whether it's, Inc. magazine or Fast Company. It's on the minds of business leaders today. And it is far and away now become the leading issue that many business leaders and HR leadership are dealing with, which is, how do we reckon with this? What's happening here? There's a lot of change happening. So we can go to the next slide, Melissa. So what's important to kind of also realize is we've already known the importance of having an engaged employee base. That's never been in question for most people who study this. Gallup has obviously done a ton of work around this. But what's really interesting now is how we look at the correlation between this level of engagement and the propensity to be looking for a new job. So now more than ever, as you can see here, those actively disengaged and not engaged folks, that becomes your Achilles heel as a business leader now. It is a mandate in a way to really be able to tackle this issue. It's not enough to sit by on the sidelines. Many organizations have stood by on the sidelines. As one of the co-founders here at Cooleaf, we've seen this over the last few years, but certainly conversations have changed now over the last 12 months. And it's largely because this is just not, this is not something that anyone can avoid at this point, and particularly emphasizes the importance of engagement and trying to do this in a new environment, trying to do it in an environment where not everyone's together physically, right? We've already talked about the distributed teams issues, right? So really this just accelerates and really kind of magnifies this huge problem that we're dealing with right now in the world of business leaders now, HR leadership dealing with this. Go to the next slide. So, how are employers doing, right? If you look at this and you say, okay, well, clearly this means that we must be starting to do things differently. The unfortunate truth is that, yes, things are going better, but this idea of investing, it's sort of like, investing in preventive care. If you had done a fairly good job up until this point, you're likely to probably not be suffering as much as some of those employers that had not put any attention or investment into this area. But clearly now, like what we see here is that still the range is between 20 to 34% in terms of the global employee engagement rate. This is again from Gallup, but most of this also bears, this is something that most people here are fairly familiar with, which is that the idea of lost productivity, of actively disengaged employees equal to 18% of their annual salary. This is not cheap stuff. And when you add it up, when you look at a company of 10,000 employees with an average salary of $50,000 each, disengagement's costing that company over $60 million a year. So this is real money. And, replacing those workers costs money, and retraining. We've known this, right? None of this is a secret. We've all known this, that those of us that are in this space, those of us that might be operating in business leadership roles, those of us those of you that are in HR, you probably know a lot of this like the back of your hand, right? It's not a secret, and it's been true up until the last year and a half, 2 years. But what's really changed now is the moment that we're in and how this has become, absolutely critical. So we can go to the next one. And so, yeah, this is not a drill, right? So we're here to talk a little bit about really practical insights and this idea of investing in your employee experience becoming a must-have for every business leader. We've always known this, and we've known it for years. I think a lot of people have known it for years, but this is the time now. If you're not investing, it's fairly certain that you will have, detrimental business results, and you may be left behind, right? So I'm happy to have Christina here from ITA Group. Christina Zurek is going to run through a number of insights that they recently, really kind of unearthed in a lot of their research that they've been doing at ITA Group. So I'm going to pass it on to you, Christina.
Thanks, Prem. Let me pull up my slides. I couldn't agree more about how hard of a time this is. At ITA Group, we've been providing employee engagement solutions for 50 plus years. And this is one of the most challenging environments that we've ever seen. And that's saying something because, when you look at the types of things that we offer, we specialize in these personalized employee engagement strategies like employee recognition, employer branding, milestone recognition and awards, employee events. We really try to attack it from a lot of different angles. And we've never seen more companies trying to think outside of the box, trying to come up with new and different ideas that they can not only attract good talent, which we always knew was going to be an issue, but really keep the good talent that they have. And so it's perfect time to be talking about this. It's something we've really, even though we've done this for decades, we continue to try to look at things differently. And really that's the impetus that led to the research that Prem just mentioned. And so basically taking you back a few years, back in 2018, we sat down and basically said we felt like what was being done to engage employees just wasn't as effective as it could be. At that point in time, there were a lot of companies that basically were just trying to look at what does a top workplace do, or what are some of the buzzy trends and perks that people are offering, and how do I jump on that? So, things like free food were a really big deal, or on-site dry cleaning. Some of these things that now they're not even relevant in today's, post-COVID world. And so at that point in time, we had said, we think there's something more meaningful at play, and we really wanted to better understand what that was. We knew that we believed in the things that we had historically been doing, but maybe there were other things that needed to be considered. And so that really is what spurred our interest in doing this research project. But it was not only about understanding what needed to be done, but also how tactically companies could drive whatever they needed to in order to ultimately motivate and retain employees. And so I always kind of laugh because I'm like, we've boiled it down to this one sentence, but it was such a monumental project that we did at this point in time. And so to give you a little bit of an idea into the depth and the breadth of what we went into, these are some of the different topics we asked about. And a lot of these are going to feel familiar to you. There's certainly things that would be asked about in a typical engagement survey, but we asked about things that oftentimes are not, and especially back in 2018, before I think companies started to think more holistically about their employees and their overall well-being. Things like employees' belief in how their job impacts their sense of self-esteem and their sense of self or belonging. Those kinds of factors were not regularly talked about, and they certainly were not being regularly asked about when employees were being surveyed. And so this really was a groundbreaking effort for us to explore. And part of why we were able to get into this really unique point of view is because we worked with an actual psychologist to help develop what we were going to be asking about and then actually analyze those findings as well. Our goal at the end of the day, like I said, was we felt like something was being missed. So we needed to approach it from a different direction than what had historically been tackled in the market. And so as a result of this, we basically talked to thousands of people, talked to them about, why do they engage at their organization? Why don't they? How does working at their company make them feel? Are they proud to talk about where they work? All of those kinds of questions. It took on average a person almost a half an hour to complete the survey, which is a really long time. I don't recommend you put most people through that, but we had so many things that we wanted to better understand. And what was cool was once we analyzed those findings, basically it became clear to us that there are three types of needs that employees have when it all boils down to it. And we call these their psychological benefits. And so there are three separate categories. We'll go into more depth on each of these, but just hitting at the tops of the trees, there's functional benefits, which are basically things that we've focused on historically. They're things that a person feels like the company helps them accomplish or do. So think about something traditional like compensation or work-life flexibility, very tactical. The next category are those emotional benefits. And just like they sound, they're about how working at the company makes an employee feel, or how does it make them want to feel. And the third category are these identity benefits. And there's technically three separate types that all contribute to this: personal, cultural, and social identity. But at the end of the day, what it helps us evaluate is, how does an employee feel like working at the company reflects on them as a person? What does it say about them as an individual? And so as we dug into this, it became clear that, one, it was really cool that we could see that basically this is what it breaks down to, these three categories. But more than that, we found that taken together, these psychological benefits explain 70% of the reason why an employee engages or doesn't. And that 70%, depending on your background, may feel low, but I was reassured by the analysts we were working with, who are fantastic statisticians, which I am not. They said humans, it turns out, are super squirrely, and we're really hard to understand why they engage or why they don't engage, why they do things or don't do things in general. And so for them to get to a 70% confidence level with this model was really outstanding, because typically they're targeting like 50%. So that was great to hear. Obviously, that gave us a lot of belief in this model, and knowing that it could really help an organization change the course of their employee engagement levels. But what's more is really the impact and the potential of these psychological benefits for an organization, because what we found was that when you do effectively meet all of those psychological benefit needs for an employee, they're actually 3 times more likely to be satisfied, engaged advocates of your business. And that's what we're all after at the end of the day. That's what we're trying to do, is keep people happy, fulfilled, talking positively about your organization to their peer networks, and ultimately contributing to their full potential for the organization. So rest assured, this model is really a strong one in terms of what it can offer for an organization and what we learned from it. And so at this point, I'm going to transition into, like I said, doing just a little deeper dive into each of those categories to make sure you really understand kind of what's all packed into each of those 3 groups. And then also just a few of the interesting insights that we drew from the research that maybe can spotlight some potential areas of trend or opportunity within your own workforce. So first up, I'm going to start with the functional benefits. Like I said, this is something that we've all spent a lot of time on. So this basically helps us evaluate an employee's satisfaction with their overall compensation package, work-life balance policies, conveniences, and their perceived abilities to achieve professional goals. So lots of things that we've already been focusing on, things that have certainly gained importance in this post-COVID world, but they're really kind of where we've spent the bulk of our efforts. Emotional benefits, on the other hand, like I said, so that helps us better understand, how does working at an organization make an employee feel? And specifically, we're trying to better understand positive versus negative emotions. But because emotions aren't as simple as just a positive or negative, we look at both what we call activation and valence. So basically what that means is how positive or negative is the emotion, but also how strongly felt is that emotion. And so while on the surface it can feel like we were just looking for like good versus bad emotions, we actually looked at dozens of different types of emotions that employees were telling us that they felt day to day, to try to figure out how those ultimately contributed to their overall engagement level. And then the final one that I'm going to break down into those 3 different subcategories were those identity benefits. And so the first one that rolls into that is what we call cultural identity. And basically this is an employee's alignment with and appeal of the company culture. So do they feel like the culture is clear, and do they feel like they like the company culture, is what we are evaluating there. Social identity, on the other hand, was really more about how well do employees identify with or respect their colleagues, peers, and company leadership. It's really more about those interpersonal relationships that are at play. And then the final category are these personal identity benefits. So this is, spoiler alert, top driver of employee engagement. This was, if we had to pick just one thing that was the most important, it's personal identity. And it's not surprising at all, because this is what you're hearing about now. It is an employee's sense of self-esteem, purpose, and belonging. But back in 2018, we were just starting to hear about these kinds of things. There was nothing like the amount of attention that we are now seeing on this element. And so it's really cool to see this now coming full circle, because at the time it was kind of like, wow, I had never really thought about tapping into that side of things. And now we're starting to see so much more attention on it, which is great. So that being said, I told you I wanted to spend a little bit more time digging into some of the specific findings that we had beyond just overviewing the framework itself. And so I want to start off right away by digging into this topic of personal identity, since we know it is such an important part of what we're hearing today that employees want. So when we think about what impacts employee self-esteem and the work that they do, one of the ways that we evaluated that was by asking them, does working at your company make you feel good about yourself? And so what was interesting was we found that people managers were actually much more likely to say yes than individual contributors. Similarly, we saw a very linear relationship where basically as your level within the organization went up, you were much more likely to say that you felt good about yourself working there. This one was surprising to me. So client-facing or customer-facing respondents told us that they actually were much more likely to feel good about themselves than those who were not. You know, this is surprising to me because so often you hear about the negative side of things. When you are in that demanding role where maybe you are on the front lines of, providing customer service, being right in front of the customers that your organization is taking care of, whether that's patients or retail shoppers or somebody calling in for help. But across the board, we saw a lot of consistency in terms of people who were client-facing just overall having higher self-esteem. And then finally, we did notice that there was a difference in male versus female breakdown. So males were more likely to say that working at their jobs made them feel good about themselves versus females. What was really interesting, though, is what didn't impact employee self-esteem. A lot of times there's, people knocking, especially the younger generations in the workforce. We did not see a significant difference in terms of employee generation impacting their self-esteem. And similarly, we didn't see it with income either. And so while we did see that linear relationship with level in the organization, it was not tied to compensation. And that was a really key takeaway for us. As we delved through these results and tried to make sense out of what can companies do about this, there was one more trend that emerged that I think is important for us to cover. And it's something that we call the reality slump. It has a really negative sounding name because it's a really negative issue that we identified. And so basically what we found is that it's a period of time, generally 1 to 2 years post-hire, when employees are most likely to turn over. And to show you what that looks like in a graph form, basically what we did here was we mapped each of those psychological benefits, so those needs that employees have, and we mapped that across employee tenure of all of those people that we talked to. Keep in mind, this is tenure with the organization that they were responding on behalf of. This was not total tenure in the workforce. And so what we found was within 1 to 2 years of having joined an organization, we saw every single one of those psychological benefit needs decrease in terms of how effectively they were being met. A lot of them bounced back eventually, but it could take years for that to happen. And so that was really a fascinating finding. What is concerning about it, in addition, though, to just it being present, is that it's so prevalent and pervasive that it's impacting those bottom line organizational measures that are so important as well. So that includes engagement, advocacy, and satisfaction, which you're looking at here. So on this chart, we mapped based on employee tenure, were they satisfied or dissatisfied with the organization? And so you can see in those blue bars, their satisfaction hits one of those lowest levels possible during that 1 to 2 year tenure range, while the dissatisfaction peaks to a pretty significant 19%. That was really mirrored when we looked at advocacy, or that willingness to recommend an organization. And what's concerning about that is people who have been with a company for 1 to 2 years are viewed as credible to their peer networks. And so as we are all competing for top talent, and trying to win that talent from other organizations, if you have this group of people who are viewed as credible resources about your organization not supporting it, that can be really detrimental to those efforts. So we just need to really keep an eye on that specific tenure segment to make sure that we're thinking of all kinds of different ways that we can be supporting them, because clearly there's an issue. The final point that I like to talk to about the reality slump is that it is blind to traditional demographics. So just like we saw kind of with generation and income level not impacting self-esteem, same story here, where it impacts equally across employee age, generation, level in the income level. All of those factors are impacted the same way. It's not like it's just targeting one specific segment of the workforce. So that was really fascinating to me to see that. So it's indicative of the fact that those people just across the board, when they've got just 1 to 2 years of tenure with your organization, they really do need more support than what we've been giving historically. So that's really kind of the high level summary of what did we learn through the research into what is going on with employee engagement and why are certain people engaging. But there was another piece of this puzzle that we really were trying to uncover through our research project. And so part 2 of it was really us stopping to say, okay, so that's a different way of looking at it, but what do I do with that? How do I, actionably improve my organization based on now knowing that these psychological needs need to be met? And so that's where, with the second part of our study, we really try to delve into the initiatives that employers are offering. We wanted to know basically what's working and what's not. What should they keep spending money on, and what maybe is less of a priority, because there are so many great things being offered, more than have ever been offered before now at this point. And the problem is it just is really hard to know what's moving the needle and what isn't. And so what was interesting was we asked about dozens of different types of initiatives and programs, and basically, is it offered at your organization? Is it not? If it's not, would you like it? How motivational is it? And at the end of the day, what rose to the top were these 6 initiatives as being the most important to employees from their point of view. So we've got company communications, company-sponsored events, recognition programs, incentive programs, professional development, and wellness programs. And what everybody thinks when they see this slide, and I've presented it many times, is, okay, that's nothing new. Like those are all things that we've always been offering, or, maybe we could be a little better with some than others. And that's true. Employees actually told us that these are very common. The problem is that employees don't like what is being offered. And that's what we're looking at here. So that first column of percentages, that's the percentage of employees whose company offers a given initiative. So you can see that that's really quite high overall to see that degree of consistency. But then in that second column of percentages, that's the percentage of employees whose company offers the initiative and they're satisfied with it. And so those numbers are so much lower than we would want them to be, which really, I think illuminates for us what the underlying issue is. It's not that we're offering the wrong things. They're just not as effective as they could be. And the reason that that is such an issue is because it's ultimately impacting employee satisfaction. So what we're looking at here was a comparison where we wanted to better understand how important are each of these initiatives. And so we found that there's a very strong correlation between overall employee satisfaction and satisfaction with a given initiative. So for example, this company communications one, we found that when employees are highly satisfied with the way that the company communicates to them, their overall satisfaction is 87% with the organization itself, versus that group where if they're not satisfied with the way their company communicates, or they don't feel like there's a clear way that they're communicating, that overall likelihood to be satisfied with the organization is way lower, all the way down at 26%. So that's why we know that this matters. That's why we know that quality matters more than quantity of these programs too. So the good news is we can improve on things that we already have in place. So let's dig in a little bit more into understanding specifically what is it that makes an initiative well received? What was it that employees were looking for? to better understand that, we actually brought the psychological benefits back into play. And that's how we developed this schematic. So this helped us understand how the psychological benefits in those colored boxes are impacting the employee engagement initiatives that employees told us were most important. And the key to that is that the reason those initiatives are perceived as effective is because they are supporting those psychological benefits. The psychological benefits are the path to employee engagement. So I know this can be a lot to kind of take in, so I want to break this down piece by piece to make a little bit more sense. So what you can see here is that cultural and social identity, so those benefits that are really supporting interpersonal relationships and the way that they feel about the company culture, those are primarily driven by company communications, events, and recognition programs, which makes sense. Those are all activities that are designed to align people, bring them together, help create relationships, give them fun ways to hang out with each other, and boost those overall feelings of connection with each other as an organization. Similarly, the personal identity benefits, they're actually also fueled by events and recognition programs, but incentive programs also come into play there. Remember, personal identity benefits are really fed by, they help contribute to an employee's sense of self-esteem, sense of belonging, sense of personal contribution to the organization. And so that's why those initiatives are specifically really effective at driving personal identity benefits. The functional benefits then, remember the things that a company makes a person feel like they're helping them achieve. Those are reinforced most effectively by recognition programs, incentive programs, and professional development programs. And interestingly, those emotional benefits are fed by the other psychological benefits. So once you're improving an employee's sense of identity benefits and functional benefits, then you will see the positive improvement in the emotional benefits that are ultimately going to get you to that employee engagement that you're looking for. Some of you may be wondering what happened to wellness programs. Wasn't that on there somewhere? And it was. What was interesting, though, is we found that an employee's perception of wellness programs and whether they were effective at meeting a psychological benefit need really depended on how the company communicated that wellness program. So this could include financial wellness, emotional wellness, physical wellness. All of those are lumped into this, but basically, if that wellness program was perceived as something that was helping the employee, for example, with the financial needs they had for healthcare. So maybe it was doing a health screening where they were able to get a reduced premium. That really was viewed as a functional benefit because that was very closely correlated to the way that they are compensated and the benefits that they receive. Versus if it was a wellness program that was presented as an opportunity to help boost their own sense of purpose and help them find what is it that matters to them. So maybe something more in that emotional well-being side of things. That's much more likely to impact personal identity benefits. So it really just kind of depended on how it was messaged. Now I have a lot of people who will look at this and say, well, basically they want to cheat the system and they say, okay, so recognition programs though, they're the key to everything. They feed all of the identity benefits plus functional benefits. So could I just have a really great recognition program in place? And would that help overcome any of the additional gaps that I might have? I appreciate everybody trying to work smarter and not harder. But the reality is that's just not what we saw in the data. What we saw was that as you combine initiatives, you see better outcomes. So what we're looking at here is company communications is this first circle, and we were looking at the percentage of respondents who felt like the company offered strong initiatives, and specifically here, company communications. So 40% of people felt like their company offered strong communications. A smaller percentage, so 28%, felt like both their communications and recognition programs were strong. And then an even smaller slice of that audience, 23%, felt like company communications, recognition programs, and events were all really effective. So we know that it's hard to do these programs all really well together, and we know that because the percentage of employees who feel like that's happening is smaller as it gets more inclusive. But the reason that's important is because we saw satisfaction, extreme satisfaction, so the highest rating possible, really accelerate as you got more of those initiatives pulled together. So as you can see here, it really does matter at the end of the day if you can have those initiatives work in combination with each other. So with that, normally I can talk for an hour or more about this, so I feel like I have flown through this. This is a high-level overview of kind of what this research is about. There's tons more information on ITA Group's website, and then we'll send out as a follow-up that you can access about this. But before I go, I cannot wait to share that we are actually in the process of redoing this research, of refreshing it, because we know that so many things have changed and we can't take anything for granted as a result of the pandemic. And so I wanted to let you guys in on a little secret and share actually a few of the key findings that we've already identified as we've been working through the new research to see kind of basically what did the pandemic change and what hasn't it changed about the psychological benefits. And so first and foremost, I want to say great job, everybody. We are actually making really good progress on supporting the psychological needs of employees across all of the positively affecting psychological benefits. We saw significant improvement in the panel that we surveyed in fall of 2021 versus spring of 2018. So overall, everything that we have been trying to do, all of the hard work that we have been doing over the past months during this pandemic to carry people through is working. We have seen improvement there, so feel great about that. The less positive news that I have is that there are still segments that need our help. So the reality slump is still there. We are still seeing that in the 1 to 2 year tenure range. It is still affecting everybody across age, generation, income level, role. But what is interesting is we've actually seen a second slump emerge. And so this is in the 11 to 19 year tenure range. So these are your very tenured people. And what is interesting here is it's responding differently. So this is actually, it's primarily gender driven. Females in the 11 to 19 year tenure range are significantly less engaged right now than their counterparts. So something to keep your eye on. We will have lots more discussion about this as we roll out the official research report and more findings. But the final note I want to end on about this is a message of hope. Because what you're looking at here is the difference in employees who strongly agree that their employer wants to develop and retain them in that 1 to 2 year tenure range and how those psychological benefits are performing. So we know that the reality slump is a terrible, awful thing, but it doesn't have to happen to everybody. And so what we're seeing here is actually those employees who do believe that their employer genuinely wants to develop and retain them. If you can get them to see how much you care, you can actually circumvent the whole thing. You can stop that reality slump from happening. You can improve this psychological benefit performance by quite a bit. So lots of messages of hope and optimism coming out of this new research, I would say, at the end of the day. Some good areas of opportunity. We're specifically diving into deskless workers and remote workers and trying to better understand their needs. So stay tuned for more to come on that. You can certainly subscribe if you don't get updates from ITA Group. Go to our blog, sign up on our insights to be kept in the loop, and then in the next month or so, you'll see those new findings coming out. So I feel like I just went lightning speed through all of this. I should take a breath and turn it over to Prem, who I think now is going to walk us through just some of his key takeaways from our discussion so far.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. That was great. Super helpful, hopefully, for everybody. And I see some questions coming in already. So, it's great to kind of see the research that you all have done, kind of going a layer deeper than what I think you typically see in a lot of the research. That say you've gone down to the very tactical level, which I think is really important. So, when I think about the important key takeaways that we kind of look at through the research, first of all, employee experience, that has always, from our estimation, been a must-have, but now it's really, truly becoming a must-have for every organization. And those leaders that are focused on that total well-being that you talked about, they're positioned to lead. We should also think about, understanding employee psychology better, right? And that the fact is that most of these engagement initiatives are failing to hit the right mark when they're well received, you see that stronger linkage to employee satisfaction, and that combination, which I think is a really critical point. This idea that the combination of communications, recognition, sponsored events programming correlates to those initiatives being well received and higher employee satisfaction. It's something that we've seen out in the field, in practice with many of our customers. As we think about some of the things that we do to combine those, we look at it as a holistic initiative, right? It's not that you can separate these things out. And oftentimes, one of the things that we didn't talk about also is a little bit of the data challenge that comes to separating those things out. And the idea of running them as a cohesive unit really becomes super important for business leaders, for HR leadership now. And at the end of the day, right, like, it's not a time to stand still. This is the time to start thinking about ensuring that your engagement initiatives, if you have them in place, are they aligned to best practices? As we get into 2022, you may have some of these things in place today, but are you following some of the best practices that we've talked about? Are you aligning your initiatives to those? So again, thank you, Christina, for going through this. And I know, Melissa, I'm going to go and pass it to you.
Thank you. Yeah, that was all super insightful. Thank you guys so much for being here. So we're going to get to questions in a minute, but first, I just wanted to point out that we're going to be sharing this great resource with everyone after the webinar in your email today. So this is 5 strategies to combat the Great Resignation. And this guide explores some of the big gaps in culture that Christina and Prem talked about, things that are commonly overlooked, and how you can really correct those to compel your employees to stay. So look out for that in your inbox later today, along with a link to the replay. I know that was a question, will we be sending out the replay in these slides? And yes, we will definitely send those out to all of you. So we want to hear your feedback on this guide and also on the webinar today as well. So before we jump into the Q&A, I just wanted to ask everyone if you have a few minutes to fill out our post-webinar survey. So you'll be directed to that as soon as the webinar ends today, and we'll also send out an email with that link. But yeah, we definitely want to hear your feedback. We really appreciate you all. And we do have a couple of questions that are coming in. So I'm going to get started with the one from Chelsea that we just got. So Christina and Prem, feel free to jump on at either one of these. Feel free to jump in. So the first question from Chelsea is, can you give examples of how recognition programs, incentives, and events should be communicated out to be the most effective?
Christina, did you want to take some of that? And I could probably jump in also.
Sure, I can get us started. So I'd say, the key is really thinking about who you're communicating it to. I'd say first and foremost, the way that somebody working on a factory floor is going to comprehend information and somebody who's working remotely from home, a desk-based job, is going to be really different. And so really just taking time to think through what are your different segments of your employee audience. If they're all the same, great, that makes it a little easier. If they're not, think about how those differences can be leveraged in order to make that communication more effective. I would say in terms of specifically, how do you think about reinforcing like the key messages of the psychological benefits through the way that you're communicating about recognition and incentive programs and things like that, is I think just taking that step back and thinking, what's in it for the employee? Like, why are you offering it? Are you offering it just because, if you find yourself and you're like, well, we're offering financial wellness just because we heard that it's a good thing. Well, but what does that really matter to the employee for? How is that ultimately going to help them, feel better as a person, help their family, improve their job performance, those kinds of things. So I think the more specific you can get with that message, the better, ideally. And I think the catch is, to communicate well isn't usually easy. It usually takes more than just one communication touch point, whether that's an email or a poster or, a flyer in the break room. Making sure that your leaders are also enabled to reinforce those messages specifically to that individual role level is really important too. So those are a couple of the ways that I've seen effective communication of those. Anything else you'd add, Prem?
I would add just to that, I think those are great points. I'd say that idea that you talked about this is not a one and done type thing, right? It's ongoing campaigns throughout the year. We found, our methodology around challenges is something that we've found a lot of success with our customers, which is essentially small campaigns that can be run throughout the year that address different priority points, whether those are business priority points, whether those are recognition itself, right? Becoming a campaign. The idea of sort of using small, short attention span. I mean, everyone's got short attention spans now, so you have to be able to kind of fit into that framework and use small, discrete campaigns. And so we found that to be really super effective in our experience.
Great. Thank you guys both. And thank you, Chelsea, for the question. So the next one we have is from Laura. So I think you guys can probably both jump in on this, but I think this was kind of referencing what you were talking about earlier, Christina, with combining initiatives to meet the different benefits. So Laura wants to know, can you give an example of what combining those initiatives would look like?
Yeah, I'd say so. Really, it's just offering both of them or offering multiple. It's not necessarily trying to like weave a recognition program together with an incentive program. I think sometimes companies do that as well, but it's I think more just about making sure that you're offering all 6 of those most important program types to your organization in some way or another is really the key there to that message I was sharing.
Great, thank you. And then a couple more questions that we had. This one is about having different age groups in the workforce. So we have people of vastly different age groups. What's the key to tailoring engagement to individual groups by age, or is there a way to do that?
I'll jump here because it's something I'm super passionate about. I hear a lot of people ask a lot of questions that are focused on generation and just how can they especially be more effective at engaging those darn millennials is usually what it is. And what is interesting is both through our research and just even through my practical experience in the industry, generation matters a lot less than we think it does. At the end of the day, I embrace the philosophy that I've heard Netflix talk about, where basically when they think about their user base and the way that they make recommendations for, how to segment their outreach to their customers, they realized very early on that somebody, a 50-year-old guy living in Tennessee who likes Breaking Bad has a lot more in common with an 18-year-old girl who also likes watching Breaking Bad than a 50-year-old woman who likes watching the Great Baking Show. And so I think it's a good example that reminds me of it's really more about interest, life stage, the what's in it for them kind of message that I was talking about communicating in terms of reinforcing the value of why you're offering what you're offering. They're just so much more important than age in my experience.
That's super interesting. And then Francisca also had another question. For organizations that have little to no budget for their team events, do you have any suggestions or creative approaches to do something for the teams?
Yeah, I can probably jump in on that. I mean, so it's a great question. I think what we've seen is, particularly with distributed work right now, it's become, the idea of, doing events obviously is, it's different now, right? So we've seen some great examples of, organizations, small, mid-size, leverage things like company challenges to, virtual challenges. These are some examples. I think what we found early on in the pandemic was like Zoom, happy hours, things like that. It just got tough. And you're even seeing that like kind of fatigue set in with a lot of Zoom right now. So this idea of kind of keeping it fresh with different types of challenges that can be virtual, that can engage people on a variety of different fun things, social, cultural, fitness. We've seen those work really well, and at a budget level that really typically does tend to work well for small and mid-sized organizations. At least in our experience, that's been super helpful for culture and keeping that culture alive.
Yeah, and on the marketing side, we're really passionate about kind of sharing those creative ideas that we work with tons of different organizations and see all kinds of really creative ideas play out within them in the remote world or hybrid world. So we have a lot of resources on like our marketing blog, and I know ITA has a lot of things like that too. Cooleaf recently came out with a holiday activity guide that we're giving away for free. So Francisca, I can definitely send that to you and send that out to anybody else who's interested as well. We love kind of sharing those ideas. So thank you for your question. And this one is actually kind of related to that. What's a good avenue to take if we're already really heavily using Slack and we want to grow engagement in a remote workplace environment?
Yeah, and I can jump in, and Christina, if you have any thoughts, but from our standpoint, Slack, Microsoft Teams are a great starting point for establishing kind of the tactical layer of communication and collaboration. What they don't do as sort of purposefully is really try to drive engagement into the organization from more of the emotional and philosophical kind of buy-in of what the organization does and how that can manifest itself. And so we have found, at least in our experience, that working within those environments, integrating into those environments is really important, and making sure it's seamless for employees so they don't have to go from place to place. So a lot of our platform capabilities are meant for integrating deeper into those organizational kind of communication and collaboration platforms. And Christina, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, just, I think there's also the importance of online and offline interaction too. And so I think that while a lot of companies are still distributed and may stay distributed, it's also thinking about what are those opportunities where you can bring people back together. I know the Cooleaf team just had a big on-site gathering where all of them were able to come together. I think that kind of stuff is so critically important to just sustaining some of those relationships and those interpersonal connections that the research showed us was so important. So I would say, just looking for additional opportunities for that face-to-face is still important too, especially as we get a little bit more back to normal gradually.
Great. Thanks. And we have one more question before we wrap up. So this one is, how can HR leaders encourage managers and leaders to support team engagement efforts and initiatives? So helping people, I guess, the managers and leaders on the team level support that engagement.
I can get us started at least on this. So this is something I'm also really passionate about. A lot of the clients that we help are large organizations, and a lot of times their workers are very distributed. So like we work for a retailer who has 400,000 employees. And so to not take the time to really think about that manager impact is a critical miss in a program like that, especially because it's just too large. It's too hard to reach all of those people through one corporate channel. And so we do a lot of different manager enablement activities, whether that's, creating a segmented piece of communication to them to make sure they understand, as a manager, what do we expect you to be communicating about this initiative? Or here are some questions you might get from your team. Here's how to answer them. But really helping them show up well is important because they're busy too. We know they have 1,000 other things on their plate. So we really try to be very intentional at thinking about it, not through the lens of needing to bother them with something else, but how do we just help them show up better? And one way that we've actually been doing more of that is through automation, which has been really cool. So basically, we've identified that there are certain triggers where, for example, if we see an employee hasn't been recognized for 30 days, that's a trigger in our database where we know that that person should be getting kind of tapped on the shoulder by their manager. And maybe that means the manager sends them a recognition because they know they haven't gotten it. Or maybe that's that manager having a check-in with them to just kind of see how things are going. Or that manager behind the scenes, hearing from somebody else on that person's team, like, boy, Melissa did an awesome job in that meeting, and saying, you should really send Melissa a recognition and make sure she knows how much you valued her input. All of those kinds of activities can have nudges or automated reminders attached to them so that we can help those managers show up at those critical moments that we've learned are so important to overall employee well-being. So that's one way we're working through both kind of proactive and then also, reactive adjustments for leaders to just help them show up better to the people that they're supporting.
Yeah, I just echo that, like, that's the critical component of the success of any program, right? It's the ability for manager buy-in. And, we spend a lot of time on that early on. And I think it's a critical part of the process for our implementation onboarding is that, this is not a tool meant for someone sitting in an ivory tower, right? These are platforms, and that idea of sort of coming in and partnering with the customer to ensure that your line leaders and your managers know about that platform and can use it effectively. And again, to your point around nudges, really important. So I just echo that.
Thank you, guys. I think we're at time now, so I really appreciate you all for joining us today, sharing your questions. If you have other questions afterward, oh, sorry, turn my video off. If you guys have other questions afterward, please feel free to reach out to us by email. Again, we'll be following up with that replay and the links to the slides. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, Christina and Prem, for taking the time and sharing your insights with us. It's been really valuable. We learned a lot.
Thanks, Melissa.
Thank you, everybody, for joining and for hosting. It's been great.
Thank you. Bye,
Yeah.
guys.
Bye.
Hey, everyone.